want to start by saying that I live a pretty straightforward, clean lifestyle. So I'm certain that what I saw and heard last New Year's Eve was definitely not a hallucination or caused by being drunk. It was 100% real. I live on the outskirts of a typical small southern town, and some of my friends live even further out in the countryside, only accessible by those dark, winding back roads. One of my friends, Darren, lives in a nicer neighborhood that can only be reached by those same back roads. Every year, his family throws a party on New Year's Eve, inviting all their friends, including me. It's always a good time, so I'm always excited when I get the official invitation from Darren's parents in the mail. Since the weather in the south can be pretty unpredictable in the winter, it wasn't until just a few days before New Year's Eve that it actually got really cold. I remember the sudden chill in the air and the bumpy, poorly maintained country roads made for a pretty uncomfortable ride to Darren's house. Normally, I don't drive with my brights on because I hate it when other drivers blind me with theirs. But the sheer darkness of the winding, narrow road made it necessary this time. The road was flanked by dense trees on both sides, so even with my brights on, it was tough to see all the twists and turns ahead. There were no other houses between the turnoff and Darren's neighborhood except for an old shack that looked abandoned, though I could sometimes see lights inside when passing by. A few minutes into my drive, on a particularly straight part of the road, I noticed something white up ahead in the trees. As I got closer, I saw it was a person standing all alone on the side of the road. They weren't moving, just standing perfectly still, facing the trees. It was a woman, wearing what seemed to be a white dress or gown. Definitely not something you'd wear in cold weather. I didn't turn off my brights out of caution, so I couldn't really make out many details because of the glare from her white dress as I drove by. I was relieved she didn't step into the road, forcing me to stop. But then I started to think maybe I should have stopped to check if she needed help. Maybe she was another guest trying to get to Darren's party. But it wasn't until I glanced back in my rearview mirror, seeing her in the red glow of my brake lights, that I realized she had turned her body to follow me, still standing in the same spot. That was pretty creepy, and in that moment, I was glad I wasn't the type to always play the Good Samaritan. There was no way she was a party guest. I made it to Darren's party around 8 p.m., parking in the gravel circle among the other cars outside his house, which was in a large clearing surrounded by forest, just like the other houses in the neighborhood. The party continued on until we watched the ball drop in New York and our own local clock strike midnight, after which people started leaving. I stayed behind a bit to help clean up, as I usually did since I was one of Darren's closer friends. And by the time I left, my car was the only one left at the front of the house. When I started my car, the low tire pressure light came on. My car is old, so it didn't tell me exactly which tire was low or how many had the issue. Before I started to panic, I remembered that this always happens with my tires when the weather first gets cold after a warm spell. I figured I'd be able to make it home okay. But before I left, I remembered the woman I had seen on my way there. Was she still out there somewhere? Had anyone else seen her? There was another route I could take to avoid that road, but it would add an extra 20 minutes to my drive, which I didn't want to do late at night, especially with the possibility of drunk drivers around. So, I decided to suck it up and take the same road back. I really wish I hadn't. Not even a few minutes into driving down that same dark back road, I could tell something was wrong with my tires. I could even hear it. It sounded like metal scraping against the pavement. Slowly, my car came to a complete stop. Great, I muttered. This was a whole new problem. The only thought running through my head was, did my tires fall off? Against my better judgment, I decided to get out and see what had happened. Stupidly, I turned the engine off and shut the door. The car's lights went out automatically, leaving me in the pitch-black darkness of the surrounding woods. I used my phone's flashlight to check each of my tires. My stomach dropped when I saw that every one of them had been shredded, as if some animal had torn them apart. I could have maybe explained away one flat tire, considering the rough road, but all four? That was deliberate. But could it have been? I thought. I stood there, helpless. No one would be out on this road at this hour, especially on New Year's Eve. I would need to call a towing service or someone to come get me. But of course, there was no phone service this far out in the woods. Just as I was about to get back into the car, the wind stopped. The tree branches stopped swaying, and even the animals that were still active at this time of year went completely quiet. I froze. I had never heard such silence before. It was as if time had stopped for a moment, before I heard the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping somewhere in the trees. Something was moving. I quickly turned off the light on my phone, plunging everything into complete darkness. The leaves on the ground continued to rustle, like someone was moving through the forest. Was it a squirrel? A deer? No, this was the kind of silence you only hear when a predator is nearby. And then I heard it. I see you. My heart sank. All the air seemed to leave my body. I couldn't even scream. It was a woman's voice, soft and quiet, coming from the pitch-black trees only about 15 feet away. She said it without any malice, which somehow made it even creepier. In that moment, all I wanted to do was collapse and disappear. Then I heard, "Can you see me?" That's when my fight-or-flight instinct finally kicked in, but I was disoriented, standing there in the dark. I needed to turn my phone light back on if I was going to figure out which way to run. I shined the flashlight ahead of me, and standing just at the edge of the trees was the woman in the white gown, her features now visible. The gown was dirty, covered in dark stains. She was pale, unnaturally so, and thin, almost skeletal, with disheveled gray hair falling to her elbows, but her face, it was almost impossible to describe, twisted and grotesque, as if half of her jaw was missing, yet she was somehow trying to grin at me. In a panic, I kept the flashlight on her for a few moments before I turned and ran down the road back toward Darren's house. The shack I mentioned earlier was closer in the other direction, but what if this woman lived there? I don't know if that thought was logical or just a reaction in the moment, but I didn't have time to think about it. As I sprinted down the road, I heard the sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling behind me. She was chasing me, but the surge of adrenaline helped me outpace her. I made it back to Darren's house, ignoring the other homes, and knocked urgently on the door, begging them to let me in. His mother answered quickly and rushed me inside, seeing how shaken I was. I told her, Darren and his father, everything that had happened. They were sympathetic, offering me a place to stay for the night while they called the police and a towing service, which I gratefully accepted before even calling my own family. The police said they would search the area that night, and I could pick up my car and give a statement the next day. But all I wanted to do was forget the night and get some sleep in the guest bedroom. Unfortunately, I found out the night wasn't over. I woke up to a light tap on the second-story window. I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand, remembering the exact time. 3:14 a.m. Of course, the room didn't have any blinds. I didn't want to look out, but then I heard the same muffled voice from outside. "I see you." The woman was still out there. She had followed me all the way here, and now she was throwing rocks at the window to get my attention. If I wasn't going to look out before, I definitely wasn't going to now. I wasn't about to leave the bed or fall asleep until the sun came up. When daylight finally broke and Darren's family woke up, thankfully, the woman was gone. I told them everything that had happened, and we all went outside to check before the police arrived. In the yard, around the area where I had heard the voice, Darren's dad found a large, rusty knife that didn't belong to the family. It seemed like the weapon the woman had used to slash my tires. That also meant she must have followed my car to the party earlier in the night and specifically targeted me while everyone else was inside enjoying the festivities. Darren's parents contacted the other party guests to see if anyone had noticed anything strange the night before. One friend mentioned seeing someone in a white dress walking outside, but didn't think much of it since people were coming and going all night. When I gave my statement to the police, I suggested they check around that shack on the road, as I had a feeling the woman was connected to it. They eventually did, and informed me that they found no one living there. However, they did find dead, gutted animals scattered throughout the woods. That woman I saw was never found, which only raised more questions. The most frightening ones for me were how she managed to track me so quickly once I left the party. And if she was missing so much of her face, how could she speak so clearly? Despite everything that happened, I'll still go to Darren's house for New Year's Eve this year. But I'll make sure to carpool and take the long way around. When I was 26, I took a flight to San Diego. I stayed with a friend for a few days and booked a late flight back home. My flight landed at midnight. By the time I got off the plane and reached the ground transportation pickup, it was around 12:30. I hailed a random taxi from the taxi section and gave the driver my home address. He agreed to take me for $30, which was a great deal compared to an Uber. He got out to help me with my bag, but I told him I was fine with it sitting next to me, so he placed it on the seat behind him on the left side. I was sitting diagonally across from him. We got back in the car and started following the directions to my apartment, which was about a half-hour drive from the airport without traffic. Since it was late, there was hardly any traffic, and we were cruising down the highway. A couple of times, I caught the driver looking at me through the rearview mirror. On the second time, he spoke up. He asked where I was coming from. I said, "San Diego?" He replied, "Oh, very nice." Then he asked what I was doing there. I told him I was just visiting a friend. He then said, "Is your friend as pretty as you?" Honestly, I first laughed it off, but it felt a little creepy, especially since it was the third thing he said. His questions then started getting more flirtatious. He asked what a pretty girl like me was doing, traveling all alone. I sassily responded, "Well, I just told you I wasn't alone, I was visiting my friend." His reply was that by flying solo, I was technically traveling alone. I kept my sassy tone and said, "We can agree to disagree," and he laughed. claiming he was only teasing me. This guy had to be in his mid-40s, and honestly, hitting on a girl in her 20s like this felt pretty creepy. It wasn't the first time I had dealt with something like this, though. As we continued down the highway, I looked up and noticed the familiar overpass near my exit. But instead of slowing down, we passed it. I pointed out that this was my exit as we were about to pass it, but he kept going. I repeated myself more urgently, saying, "That was my exit." He apologized and said he'd take the next exit. I tried to sneak a glance at the GPS to make sure he had entered the right address, but it was angled in a way that I couldn't see it. The next exit was about a mile away. I started sitting up a little more now. As we neared the next exit, I clearly told him, "You need to get off here." And without acknowledging me, he signaled and merged off the exit. I noticed him glaring at me for a second in the rearview mirror. I almost sensed a little annoyance on his face. But that quickly changed when, less than a minute later, he asked if I had a boyfriend. I immediately replied, "Yes. He lives with me." I noticed him glance at me again, and I think he picked up on how quickly I answered. Then he asked what my boyfriend's name was. Yes, he really asked that. I decided that was enough. I told him I was going to put my headphones in, so I popped my AirPods in, even though they were basically dead. I just wanted him to stop asking me questions. Asking for my boyfriend's name felt way too personal, almost like he was interrogating me. I texted my family and close friends about this creepy taxi driver and shared my location, just in case things went south. We were now in a familiar part of my town, stopped at the first red light since we got off the highway. I glanced at the mirror, and all I saw were his eyes glaring at me in a way that felt threatening. I knew he wasn't saying anything because I didn't have music or anything playing, so I would have heard him. The light turned green, but he kept staring at me. I had to tell him the light was green before he started driving again. No one in my family had answered, except for my older brother, who must have been the only one awake. He lived 2 hours away from me. My brother told me I should leave the car if I felt unsafe. We were now on a main road in town, but there were no other cars. It was almost 1 a.m. on a weekday. We stopped at another red light, and I could feel the man glaring at me again through the mirror. Then I spotted a police car parked in an empty lot. In a split second, I grabbed my bag and backpack and opened the van door. The man yelled at me, asking what I was doing, and tried to close the door with the power button in the front, but I forced it open. As soon as the door was wide enough, I bolted toward the police car. Instead of getting out to chase me or demand payment, he just kept driving, which was a huge red flag. Once I saw him driving off, I slowed down to a quick walk toward the police car. The officer noticed me, looked up, and rolled down the window. I told him that the taxi driver had given me bad vibes, and I left for my safety. I asked if he could give me a ride home, and thankfully, he said, "Hop in the back." Being a scared woman clearly helped, but I know you shouldn't rely on cops to be your free taxi service. By the time I got in the car, the taxi was long gone. The officer drove me home, and we were there in about 5 to 10 minutes. I let myself in and didn't even bother unpacking. I went straight to brush my teeth and collapsed into bed. Just as I lay down, there was a knock at my apartment's front door. What if it was the taxi driver? He had my address after all. What if he came to demand his money? Or worse? The knocks continued for a few minutes, then stopped for a while, and then came again. I definitely wasn't going to leave my room. I stayed far away from the door. It was locked. And that was the most important thing. Eventually, the knocking stopped, and I finally drifted off to sleep. The next day, I was back at work. Thankfully, I had a later shift, so I didn't need to wake up early. While I was at work, though, I got a call from my neighbor, George. He told me that my dad had stopped by earlier, trying to get into my apartment to drop something off, but didn't have a key. George was calling to ask if I was expecting my dad, and I said no. I hadn't heard from him. George mentioned that he hadn't actually seen my dad leave anything, but had noticed him peering through the windows, which caught his attention. I thanked George and then called my dad. As expected, my dad said he was at work and hadn't come by my apartment. I took that opportunity to explain the whole taxi driver situation to him again, this time over the phone. He asked me to come home for a few nights, and I agreed, but said I needed to go home and pack my things first. After work, I got home around 9 p.m. I finished the laundry I'd left from the night before and packed a bag with clothes and my work stuff for the next few days. But something felt off in my apartment. I usually don't get nervous when I'm alone. But that night, I felt like I wasn't by myself. I think it was because the taxi driver incident still had me on edge. I kept hearing small creaking sounds in the wood floor, like the weight of someone walking, but I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I was honestly scaring myself, so I tried to rush through packing and leave. Just as I was about to head out, I heard a creak down the hallway from one of the spare bedrooms. I turned around and heard a voice say, "I'm not gonna hurt you." Then an arm swung into view from behind the wall, and I bolted straight for the front door before he could even make it into the hallway. I was outside banging on my neighbor George's door screaming for help. It was still early enough that he and his wife were awake. They rushed outside, and I begged them to help me. Instead of going into my apartment, we called 911 and waited for the police to arrive before going back inside. My apartment wasn't large, so checking all the hiding spots didn't take long. We noticed that the back sliding door leading to the shared backyard area was open, which suggested the intruder had escaped through there. Unfortunately, I didn't have any record of the taxi ride, so I didn't know the cab number, plate number, or anything else. All I could recall was that it was a yellow minivan, and I could describe the man. I did, however, give the police the route we took and the time I remembered getting into town, hoping they might be able to check local business security cameras. I grabbed my packed bags and headed to my parents' house, where I stayed for a week. They wanted me to stay longer, but I had to go back home. My dad helped me install cameras from Amazon on both the front and back doors, and I bought a taser to keep by my bed for protection. Since that incident, I've lived in 2 different apartments. I've never had to use the taser, but I now avoid taxis when I'm alone. They're harder to track than rideshare apps, and you often hear stories about fake taxi drivers kidnapping people. I still wonder if that was even a real taxi driver, or if it was a stolen vehicle.